Steve Portigal. So we have the honor of hosting Steve to close NUX 7. Steve helps companies to think and act strategically, try and say that correctly, when innovating with user insights. He's an author and a podcast host. His talk is titled The Designer is Present. It will be interactive, so get ready. And please welcome Steve to the stage.
Thanks. Thank you. So get ready. That's nothing intimidating about that, right? I promise it'll be easy and fun. So first of all, just sort of a disclaimer here. I'm going to talk about a bunch of things around mindfulness and presence, and I don't want to be that person standing on the stage that, has it all figured out and makes you feel bad about something that you're not doing to be as great and and wonderful as me. This is a journey and a process, and I'm exploring things and figuring them out, and so that's kind of what I'm sharing with you today. And hopefully it leaves you some things to try and take on with you when you leave here today, if that's something you're interested in. Here's the obscure visual reference that maybe Barry gets, but no one else is in the room. It's fine. It's an old person thing. I appreciate you laughing, even though, what are we laughing at? So a definition of presence, this term I'm kind of using here, and the classic definition of presence is about awareness, right? Being aware and connected to the present moment and only the present moment. I have sort of a working definition that is maybe a little more helpful for me, maybe a little more practical, and that has to do with being aware of what your own thoughts and feelings are, so you can make choices about how you choose to act in response to that or with that as kind of a context. Here's an example that, in the work of user research that's very much part of my experience always. And I think about this as exploding questions. In an interview, on the left is the interviewee and on the right is the interviewer. And things are going quite well in this interview. The person is sort of saying these long sentences or kind of giving a lot of information. And us, the interviewer, you got to feel a little bad for them, but this is the reality. While they're talking, you're thinking, wait, what is that? How does that work? Why is it like that? You start thinking about other things that you want to ask about because there's so much information. It always needs clarification. That's how people talk. That's what the process is like. And then, our intrepid interviewer, she gets to that pause point, and she doesn't ask any of those questions. She just says, okay. And the person continues to tell more stories, give more information. They're generating more questions. And so here's our interviewer having to sort of keep in mind all these things that have come up in the interview, plus the other questions that they're thinking they need to get to in their time, plus they're thinking about how are we doing on time, how the batteries in our devices, are they kind of being managed? You've got your colleague with you who's trying to interrupt the participant with another question. You've got to kind of manage them as well. These are all these sort of forces that are kind of pulling on you, that are kind of taking you away from, being connected to the present moment and only the present moment. It doesn't really work to do that, in that way that I defined it, and to do this work well. So you have this interesting kind of challenge. And we won't go into it, but there are mitigating techniques. This is part of what you learn to do as a researcher, is kind of how to manage this. I think sometimes, I don't say always, but sometimes that amount of pressure can kind of open up a flow state, a portal. I'm sorry for using the word portal. This is the good kind of portal. It's the portal to another dimension, where sometimes you can almost like discover this gear between two established gears that you didn't know existed, where things are speeding up and slowing down, like the jump to hyperspace, and there's all this room to kind of navigate. And that to me is kind of my experience of flow, that is driven by this demand on to be present that seems impossible, but I don't know, somehow it just flips around the other way, and you are actually just, I did a workshop once, someone called this serene hyper-awareness, which is just a beautiful description of this. My friend, who's just a great user research and leader, Gabe Chironfi, he describes this using theater metaphors. He calls it being present on stage, but still being able to attend to what's going on backstage. And so think about that as kind of this challenge that we have, and how this notion of presence shows up in some kind of work contexts. All right, so presence is a term we hear. Mindfulness is another term that we hear. We could come up with very specific definitions, but I'm going to talk about them interchangeable-ishly, if that could be a phrase. It is now. Thank you, I invented a phrase. So let's unpack them a bit and talk a little bit more about what they are. So again, meditation, a thing that I don't do, and I'm sure some of you do it because it's increasingly popular, but it's one way to develop mindfulness. If you talk to people who are active in meditating, they'll use the phrase practice. I have a meditation practice. Is that anyone would describe themselves saying they have a meditation practice? I see a couple. I can't see everyone back there, but so a couple identify with that. I love the word practice. Like, that's a revealing term that tells you something about what this is. We have medical practices, we have legal practices, we have a meditation practice. I don't know if that's the analogy there, or just the notion that this is a thing that you practice, that you do, that you repeat, that you build muscles, as opposed to a state or kind of a destination that you reach. So I just find the wording interesting. All right, you were warned there would be an activity. Here's the activity. It's really an easy one. Let's just do I'm calling it a nano meditation, which is meant to just strip any of the responsibility of accomplishing anything out of it. And you can think about, I like this quote here, it's not the absence of thought, it's the presence of awareness. So that can either open things up or just confound you, either way. So we'll just take 60 seconds, just sit, you don't have to interact, don't interact with anybody, sit, just be kind of physically comfortable, close your eyes or you leave them open, be silent. And I think your objective is to try to clear your mind of a certain kind of thought. It's that narrating voice, the one that kind of chatters away. So try that, and then we'll do a little debrief here. So let's take 60 seconds. I will use my phone somewhere to set a timer, and then I'll check in with you in 60 seconds. Okay, if you can hear my voice, make the sound of one hand clapping. Some people cheated on that one. So this is not a succeed, fail exercise. It's just an experiment to try it. And so I want to hear what some people's observations were in participating in this. I'm going to step forward so I can so to do show of hands and some shouting. What did somebody experience in 60 seconds? Quiet? Who else? Hands would be really helpful so I can call on you. Inner monologue? Say more about what was that? Yeah. And 60 seconds is not a long time to kind of, I think, get into any kind of state, but you at least notice what the thing was that you would want to not have do, which I'm going to call that a success for 60 seconds. Felt long, yeah. That's an interesting observation. Agreed? Say that again?
I noticed how tired I was.
Noticed how tired you were, yeah. Right. That's really interesting. Anybody else feel tired from that? Who else? That's hard to, yes, there he goes. I didn't hear what you said, which maybe was part of the point, but I don't know. Oh, yeah, I could hear that too. I'm sorry. I should have turned it off. Yeah. I just thought because my ears are near my mouth, but you're right. Okay. Good tip for next time. We're into the feedback portion of the talk already. Thank you. Yes, that was helpful. If no one has anything to say about the experience, you'll just start critiquing the presenter. Is that how it goes? I know we have 2 more comments out here.
So I noticed some things I didn't notice before, like the colours and the sound that was going on, just the air
So he was saying he noticed things that he hadn't noticed before, the colors and the sounds, the sound of the air conditioning. Yeah, absolutely. One more. It's going to be really awkward for you more than me if we don't get one more. Thank you. Oh, we have two more. Okay, I'm sorry. Please. Yes. You. This isn't clear who I want to have talk now? There's a lot of criticism coming at me here, you know. Breathe too loud. Don't point clearly. Yeah, so a lack of control for being unable to achieve something which was not, I didn't facilitate this particularly well. I just sort of threw you in and you're like, oh yeah, I don't know how to get to what I think I'm supposed to get to. And that, it's interesting, the sounds were sort of competing with what you were trying to get to. Yeah, that's a good observation. Last comment?
I closed my eyes and it really felt like a sense of space for me, like to distance myself from the stimulus of it.
She's saying she closed her eyes and it kind of created a sense of space and distanced you from kind of the environment that you're in. That's good. Did you feel tired though when you closed your eyes? Good. All right. All right. Thank you for that. Really interesting comments, and thanks for trying the experiment and just kind of reflecting on it. So, meditation is not the only way to sort of practice exploring presence. This is a band that I love. They're playing. This is the Waco Brothers from Chicago, playing in Austin, Texas. And just look at what's going on there. Look at their bodies. Look at their faces. Look at what's happening together. To me, this is in the zone. And I think there's an element of performance that requires presence. It requires you to be super focused on what is happening and not thinking about something else. And so, from the outside, what we observe in that picture suggests to me they're kind of at that stage. And there's other things that people talk about doing that create a sense of presence for them. People talk about sketching, painting, pottery, gardening, running, cooking, surfing and motorcycle riding. This is a great example here. I sort of think of these are sort of tasks or hobbies. I think of them almost as like facilitative endeavors that they provide their own value, but they also serve to facilitate this other kind of state. And so for people here in town, here's the Manchester Art Gallery through the end of this month. Has anyone seen this? No. Well, go see it. It's right near here. They've set up what they're calling, it says and breathe, exploring the relationship between art and mindfulness. They're trying to create an environment for experiencing art in a mindful way. And the descriptive text says, we explored how we could support the well-being of visitors by creating a space that would enable this slowing down and mindful connection to take place. So I think there's a couple of things here. One is a mindful way to experience art, and the other is just like motorcycling or playing in a band or sketching, experiencing art in a way that facilitates having an experience of presence or of mindfulness. So they built this room, and according to the text, they chose the height of the art. They chose the pieces, where they were placed in the room, the height, and kind of the furniture and the lighting, all to kind of pull you out of the rest of the gallery experience and set something up. I saw one guy sitting on his phone. These two are having a chat. I mean, whatever. The space affords a lot of different kinds of experiences. But they say we invite you to slow down and connect with art mindfully, moment by moment. Again, I'm interested in other kinds of ways that people are providing or that people are choosing to get to these kinds of experiences or things that are beneficial to them. This is from Wired magazine from a couple of years ago, and it's just their kind of commentary on certainly in the U.S., certainly in Silicon Valley, kind of corporate America overall. Mindfulness and meditation are just all the rage. So companies like Intel, LinkedIn, Google, Target, Ford, General Mills, And a lot of it is focusing on reduction in anxiety, but it's also being presented as, hey, employees, you will have a competitive advantage in your own work if you do this, if you pursue meditation activities. And of course, it's a benefit to the employers if their employees are performing better. But we see these things, these kind of attributes around mindfulness. This is from John Kabat-Zinn, who you can read more about him. He's written a lot about meditation and about mindfulness, and the more you explore this stuff, you more see there's a lot of lists of things. There's a 4 this and a 7 that. So here's his 7 attitudes of mindfulness, 2 of which have already come up today from this stage. We had, Chris talked about beginner's mind. Christina, it was kind of a side comment, but you referenced non-attachment kind of early on in your talk. It's interesting, if you look at this list and kind of what it represents and where it comes from, and see how many of these notions are finding their way into just the everyday language of our work without sort of necessarily acknowledging that, oh, it's also part of this world. And it's interesting, I think, I also feel challenged by this list. If you look at things like the last 3, non-striving, don't try to make things different than they are. Just accept the way that they are. It's kind of the next one. Don't hold on to what you want something to be. But we all work in an industry where a lot of the dominant values, the dominant pursuits are competitive, about making change, about succeeding. And so I think it's challenging for us to reconcile the things that we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be passionate. We're supposed to be, driven and have commitment. That sort of the technology and the innovation language asks that of us. But, we're kind of picking and choosing which one of these principles we want to utilize to get to that. Oh, we should have a beginner's mind. Got it. But, you can't practice non-attachment because you have to be wedded to your annual goals and your company's, key performance measures and all those kinds of things. So, I don't know, make stuff that rocks, change the world. How do you reconcile that with this? Or do you, or should you? I don't know. I kind of leave it as a question. I think just exploring the contrast is thought-provoking to me. I mean, I think this, as a field, we still think this stuff is important. Alan Cooper wrote a couple of years ago about getting outside of yourself. And it's interesting, just the language about whether we sort of talk about inside or we talk about outside, that somehow understanding and acknowledging what's inside of you requires you to get outside of who you are. There's kind of an inside-outside language here. The metaphors are kind of curious. This video is really wonderful. It's taken from a Brene Brown. It's an animation about her talking about empathy versus sympathy. People know this video. It's gone viral any number of times. I've set up a whole bunch. Anything that I mentioned here is being tweeted somewhat in sync with the hashtag, and then a whole bunch of other stuff that I just as kind of as a reading, follow-on reading. So I've tweeted this if you want to look at it later. She talks about empathy versus sympathy. And in this video, she talks about empathy is where you're hearing someone's pain and then having a connection with them. And typically that's through some way that you share some of their emotions. And the contrast there is to sympathy, where you articulate your regret or you articulate your concern, but you do it with sort of a level of remove. And I had one of the 7 principles was non-judging. I had this. It reminds me of the story. I had an experience early on in my user research career doing field work. We were studying not bottled water, but like canned water, tinned water, and how people were using it. And we go into this home to talk to someone who had been using this water that we'd provided her. And we'd been working with her for a few weeks remotely. When we meet her, she tells us right away that she has cancer, and she's kind of in a certain stage of managing that, and describes a lot about how her routines and visualizing good health, and how the water is kind of playing into that. And I've talked about this story in teaching workshops on research, and I worked with a group once, and I'm telling them this story. And the key to the story, the user research principle here is when this person said they had cancer, we did not do what you do kind of in a social setting, which is to kind of go, "Oh, I'm so sorry." We didn't address it at all. We stayed with her. We were very connected. We were like making eye contact. We were listening and nodding, and we let her tell the story about what she was doing. And we asked questions about it, but we never expressed sympathy to her. We never said, "I'm sorry." And I took a lot of criticism from this one group who felt like to not say "I'm sorry" to someone is to be inhuman and to be cold. And they couldn't sort of see any other way to kind of give that person something, human to human in that situation besides saying "I'm sorry." And I tried to talk to them that saying "I'm sorry" is about you and about what you feel like you need to do in this situation. And the harder piece, but the more important piece, especially I think in a research setting, is to be there where that person is. And she was not saying "I have cancer." She was saying "I have cancer and here's how I'm using your water." And so we were very connected with her. It was very distressing. I don't want to say I didn't feel anything, but I sort of knew that what I was feeling needed to just be kept in a different compartment until I was in my space, not when I was in her space. So I just think our struggles with what is, it's good. The video is great. Watch the video. But again, I'm talking about trying to examine your choices in the moment and think about what the range of choices you have to respond, and that it's a big key to research, I think. The way we connect with people is counterintuitive. We're not bringing our sort of social rules in there. We're bringing a different set. And I think why I like that story is it forces me to think about the choices that I made and maybe reflecting something very different. What's the difference here between the expressing empathy and expressing sympathy? What's for that person and what's for me? And as we talk about sympathy and empathy, the conversation quickly moves to compassion as another word. And so just to kind of define, so if empathy is about sort of feelings resonating with you, that you have some amount of connection, you see their pain, you can articulate someone else's pain. Compassion is described more, I think, as an intention. So it's something you want to see happen and expressing that. May you be safe, or I hope you feel better. That's a statement about an intention or an outcome for that other person. And so that's how the sort of compassion is being defined differently than empathy, where empathy is a feeling and compassion is an intention. And I bring that all up. Kelly McGonigal is a researcher at Stanford who has looked at compassion, and she writes about it as a scientist. She's not saying, be nice to people because that's how we have a happy world. She's saying, look, we've done studies about what goes on in people's brains, what kind of stress hormones are being, produced in your body, how people's breathing, how their heart rate changes, all these things that happen in our bodies when we make these kinds of choices. And so I think it's really interesting to think about this kind of from a scientific point of view, and that I've seen her talk, and it's really cool. Compassion is a thing where you set out to have somebody else be better, but what actually happens is that is helpful to you. So there's sort of different. It's going outside and inside at the same time. So I'm throwing around a lot of words here, and I'm not going to perfectly stitch them back together, but I want to just keep bouncing back and forth. Right, so the New York Times wrote about this. Not being present impairs your ability to empathize with others. The more in touch with my own feelings and experiences, the richer and more accurate are my guesses of what passes through another person's mind. They're kind of describing empathy as, without asking, trying to assess what's going on for somebody else. And feeling what you feel, so remember I said like being aware of your thoughts and feelings? Feeling what you feel as opposed to suppressing it is an ability that atrophies if you don't use it. So there's kind of that notion of practice here. There's a connection to the ability, the muscle of having empathy is tied to being connected to your own present moment and your own thoughts and your own feelings. And so, working on one piece has a connection to these other pieces here. Here's kind of a little bit of an anti-pattern, I guess. The New Yorker wrote this really amazing profile of this artist who has amnesia, such that, what's the example here? They tell her to floss her teeth, and she flosses her teeth and says, "Now what do you want me to do?" She has no ability, her memory overall is just about 2 minutes. So there's kind of a disturbing quote here. Her life is an endless series of jump cuts. In our age of pinging distractions, people often express a desire to be present, but Johnson belies such sentimentality. She is marooned in the present. It's interesting to think about, we're striving for this, but were you entirely there? It's the difference between working towards something and sort of achieving it. If you were entirely only ever in the moment, you would have this very strange life, and you can read this article and sort of see what that looks like. Yeah. A lot of the discussion about meditation, the sort of the trick to it, or the facilitation that I didn't even do at all, is concentrate on your breathing. The breathing is kind of the most simple, elemental aspect of our existence. And, separating one way to get away from your thoughts, the explanation goes, is to be centered on your breathing. And I hear a lot about, people talk about we neglect our bodies when we're thinking about our feelings and so on. When you have I heard someone describe a trauma the other day on some podcast, and they're like, I completely left my body, was kind of the state of being in a trauma. And for me, it's a big challenge. I am much, much more in my head than I am in my body. I think about this a lot. And so I was given an exercise. I'll pass it on to you. You can do it while we're talking. It's a way to kind of ground yourself or center yourself. You can just do it as kind of, just like how people have stretches on their computer, reminders about what stretches to do so they're not sitting all day. You can do a little presence activity. You can also do this when you're feeling any kind of stress or anxiety. It's to intentionally, intellectually pick up an aspect of your body and just interrogate it. Ask yourself something. What, and you can do it right now. Think about your left foot and your shoe. You're not thinking about it until I mention it. You can feel your toes, you can feel the edge of your shoe, you can feel kind of where it's tight and where it's loose, you can feel, where the heel of your sock has slipped, or you can think about your arm and how your shirt is kind of resting against it. Just inventorying what some of the tactile things you're feeling in your body is an exercise that can just pull you all the way back into your physical self. This, of course, is a big part of just the interactions we have with other people. I think about listening. This is certainly a big user research piece here. And we're often told about our body language because of what it signals. If you think about my old colleague here, Dan, and how he's modeling listening and then maybe not so much, you can look at this picture and think, if I was talking to Dan, how would I feel? But also you can look at this and say, well, what is Dan telling his body? What kind of emotional state is he creating for himself in order to be able to listen? And I think that's that kind of mind-body connection. And I always used to think that the body is sort of an expression of our inner state, that if you feel a certain way, then it manifests in your body. But to know that we can induce an emotional state for ourselves by choosing how and where we put our body, to me is very, very empowering. And I mentioned this before a little bit, that we're sort of challenged between the language of our professional culture and the things that we sort of want to do. And this, this is the pinnacle of achievement, I think. It's sort of presented to be up there on the stage with a big picture of your thing, launching it. And those are always so much about how we've already fixed it. This is sort of the Academy Awards. This is the whatever sort of the success that beyond our wildest dreams is, to say that, we know what the problem is, we know what the solution is, and that's sort of done in a way where we're kind of cutting off. and not having insight about yourself sometimes is passion or being mission driven. And you can see this in the culture of your organization or in the culture of the work that you do, or in yourself and your colleagues. Sometimes you just feel a little bit uncomfortable. If you're learning from someone you're trying to build for and they tell you something and you feel uncomfortable or judgmental, sometimes that's this kind of conflict here between their world and your world, and you feeling the pressure to hold on to what you've already invested in your model for their world. Sometimes it's at a macro level that that just people that are different than ourselves are sort of sanctioned, critiqued. We come up with nicknames for them that we use in our work processes. These are ways to kind of create distance and to sort of preserve our kind of all-seeing, all-knowing kind of vision of what we want the world to be. When phrases like frictionless sharing fall from our lips as naturally as "what time is dinner," that's a disconnect between what we want the world to be and how the world really is, and that an honest, authentic human talk sort of doesn't have any place. And that's, I think, again, we're reinforcing, we're holding on to and protecting ourselves around what we have already chosen the world to be, and that our success kind of falls from that. All right, another exercise. Do this very quickly. Do this in pairs, so just make sure everybody gets kind of included in this if you want to do it. This is a simple thing. It's just called "It's Going to Be Okay." A good part of the distraction of negativity is that it just pulls us out, right? That criticism of ourselves or worry or self-doubt, that's all about the future, right? What could happen? What is this future catastrophe? So negative thoughts is also a thing we want to avoid if we want to try to be present. Or being present is a way to not sort of fall a victim to negative thoughts. You can look at it either ways. So if you can kind of tamp down fear, you can move back to that present moment and just deal with that moment. So let me describe the exercise, and then I'll just give you just a very short time to do it. Each of you in your pair, think of something to worry about. It can be a real thing that you are worried about, or it can just be an imaginary thing. Somebody did vampires once. It's fine. It can be very, very minor. It can be very, very major. That's up to you, whatever you want to do. With your neighbor, here's what the little interaction should be. Take turns. Tell your neighbor what your fear is. Your neighbor says, "It's going to be okay." And then you say, "Yes." I'm not sure why you're laughing, but we have a debrief and you're going to tell me why. And then just switch. I want you just to practice this little interaction. Okay? So I just want you to see what it feels like, just like our nano meditation. If it doesn't work, that's fine. Let's just experiment. I want you to play with it. All right, I'm just going to give you like less than 2 minutes to do this. Very quickly. If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. Got it on 2. All right, same deal as before. Just thoughts about what happened when you tried that. I don't want to hear what you did, and more I want to hear what it felt like.
The voice inside my head was just going, but it's not going to be okay.
Okay?
It didn't feel convincing.
Okay, good. Thank you. Who else? Yes. Felt fake. Very interesting. Okay, great. You believed it for a moment.
When somebody kind of puts that thought into your head, it's going to be okay, you think, actually, it could be okay.
So you kind of examined it. Oh, it could be okay. It sounds like you sort of netted out, maybe not, though. Yeah. I heard that it felt nice knowing that, and I didn't hear that. Yes, good. So there's an interactive element here that had some impact. Good. Who else?
The inspiring, terrifying, of terrifying possibilities, so that you became much more
the terrifying spiraling possibilities became, and then I didn't.
Necessity of possibilities of all the things that could go wrong with my problem suddenly became interesting curiosities rather than something to be scared of.
Wow, that's beautiful. They became interesting. Yeah, okay. I'm glad I asked. They became interesting curiosities. Okay, that's good. That reminds me of how people talk about meditation. Again, big words. I do not meditate. I think the description is that it's not about silencing that chattering voice. It's sort of learning how to like notice it and go like, oh yeah, that's a thing. I have that kind of thing in my head, and then just kind of letting it kind of drift away. And I think in like 30 seconds you modeled some of that with this exercise, or I'm going to say that you did. That's a great reflection. Anyone else? It felt emotionally comforting, but your head did not agree with it? That's, okay, so if the head is not agreeing with it, what's the part that is agreeing with it? Oh, I like how you're pointing to like a part of your body that's like your gut or something, yeah. Wow, that's a beautiful description. These are great comments, you guys. All right, do we have one more? I'm really just making you guys work for this, huh? Yes.
The more I started speaking about it, the more the dots started joining together about how deep it went.
Wow. Can you say more about the dots that we're joining together?
I suppose it was the state of global politics and the probable eventuality of the Third World War.
Yeah. Sure. I said you could do vampires, but you're like, yeah. So I can't tell. Was that a positive outcome or a negative? Is the dots connecting like, holy crap? Or is the dots connecting like...
Yeah, I don't know, just a realistic overview of it.
Yeah, okay. So there's something about, it's the comment before about kind of spiraling. Maybe you were able to pull it down a level. That's great. This was like the tiniest little exercise. And I think we got the range of like, I don't buy it, this is fake, I felt it in my stomach. Like, there's a lot of things that are going on. So thank you again for kind of playing with these things and just see where they take us. This is Bodie, a neighbor dog who we used to walk by with our dog. And he used just to really scare us. He would sort of lunge at the fence and just bark really aggressively, and we were afraid of him, both my dog and I. We would sort of run past, we'd sort of think, oh, this is a bad dog. He's some kind of destructive monster, and I don't know if you can see the fence is newly replaced, the lattice work up there. I couldn't get a picture with him and the destroyed lattice work, but we sort of laugh at that family because they always have to keep replacing it because he keeps destroying it. And one day, I don't know why this happened, but I decided to kind of shift the frame that I was in and that I was putting him in. And I just said in that voice that you talk to a dog, I said, get your ball. And all this dog has ever done was just like lunge at us. The dog had disappeared and then like walked back and then, showed up with his ball. I didn't know the dog had a ball. But it completely reframed everything. It was like, oh, I had a whole assumption here that, around who this dog was and what my relationship was. And I was able to just reframe it and kind of change the assumption and change the experience. I'm going to just skip here and go to another story. This just happened really recently. Not everyone in the United States knows this, but Michigan, state of Michigan looks like a hand or a mitten, right? So Michigan people always use that as kind of their map. We live in California, and we had our neighbor come over to visit, and he's a guy with, significant cognitive disability, and very friendly, and we were chatting with him, and he asks us about this trip we have coming up. He says, where are you going? And my wife says, oh, we're going to Michigan. He says, oh, where in Michigan? And so she puts up her hand, and as all Michigan people do, and she explains to him, first of all, here's kind of how Michigan works, and then she starts showing where it is. And he's interested in this, and he's watching her, and he puts out his other hand, which, is sort of wrong. It's not how the map works. And what did Anne do? She just carried on with her story. She didn't say, no, that's wrong. That's not how we want to, you got to use the other hand. It didn't matter. It wasn't relevant. She was very present in that moment in choosing how to talk with him and what to share. And so just thinking about being present can help you kind of strip away what's irrelevant and what you don't need to kind of share to kind of get to the outcome that you're looking for. It was a really great moment. I've been thinking a lot about physical presence. We'll see what happens when we go to the bar afterwards. If you're in crowds, if you're in lines, I don't know. I feel like I'm always the one talking to someone who's gesturing, or like waving a drink around, and like I'm the one making eye contact with the person over their shoulder who's like ducking out of the way. I definitely do this as well, and not just when we're holding our phones, but just when we're in physical space. I think, you just can think about your physical presence and being aware of like, when you see somebody drop a bag, do you notice that and think you should help, or are you kind of in your physical space? So this is another area I think to explore around presence. Yeah, I mean, for sure, this is, there's more and more stats that Sherry Turkle wrote a few years ago. 89% of cell phone owners said they'd used phones during the last social gathering they attended, but they weren't happy about it. There were all these stats about sort of dissatisfaction. And I think, for us in the work that we do, we have to really think about what kinds of environments are we creating? Are we inviting people to be present? Are we inviting people to pull out of that? And you could say they're being present in another environment, but then we have to sort of straddle the two worlds. I think that's pretty challenging. Just a few things, just a few slides to wrap up here around what are ways to get better at it, at being present. One is, I don't have any stats, but experientially and conversationally, it seems like this gets better with age. So just stick around, and I think your skills for this will grow. Improv, I think, is basic training for presence. If you've done improv, you kind of know this. It asks you to set aside your default, which is, well, actually, and explore what it means to say yes to somebody. Chris Miller, who's an improviser I interviewed a few years ago, he says, your task is to make the other person look good. So he's giving you this task that focuses on somebody else and focuses kind of on the moment. And so, if this is about a practice, here's a way to kind of practice building muscles and figuring out what some of this looks like so that you can bring it into other areas of your life. Just a couple of quick things here. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a whole thing. It's about reframing, just like Bodhi, the bad, scary dog. We jump to a lot of conclusions about the cues that we receive, and CBT invites you to just take those assumptions and question them. Again, negative thoughts take you away from the present moment. The present moment is a sort of it's a way to prevent the negative thoughts. So these things are supporting each other. So we tell stories about someone else. That person was so angry and they were just so rude to me and they just seemed to be really, really snooty towards me when I gave them this document. And then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what other reasons could there have been for their behavior? It's not about answering that question. It's about reminding yourself that there are alternatives in our experiences besides the one that we jump to. And that's kind of a muscle to build that can, again, kind of help you eliminate the negative and stay in the moment. A practice that I'm really curious about is this idea of a noticing practice. This is from Sid Harrell's Facebook. Sid Harrell's a researcher and just a really amazing person. She writes about the San Franciscan of the day, and she writes these just beautifully succinct, funny, evocative descriptions that her power of observation and crystallizing that into a few sentences is just a thing of beauty. And for her, there's an ethical framework. This is not about judging. This is about just really, it's not about criticizing, as there is a judgment. She's appreciating it. It's always something that she feels positive about, and trying to describe for her, make herself, her practice is to describe as completely so that you can picture it. So this is an interesting kind of practice that she's kind of found for herself. If this is a topic you're interested in, I would recommend this book, 10% Happier. It's an American news presenter's sort of memoir about living this out-of-control life with competition at work and substance abuse, and he's very skeptical, but he slowly finds his way to use some of these tools and to kind of get to a point in his life where he's, as he says it, 10% happier. And then just to explain what's the title of this talk, the designer is present as an homage to Marina Abramović, who's like one of the earliest performance artists. There's a great film called The Artist is Present that's about this retrospective at MoMA in New York City. And one of the things she did there was sit in a chair all day, every day for, I want to say like 8 months or something like that. And people from the museum-going public would come and sit opposite her and not speak. And like all these interesting, profound things happened. Anyway, I encourage you to see that movie if it's at all interesting to you. It's really kind of fascinating. And the thing that we're not going to do, don't worry, is practice this exercise ourselves and see what happens. You've been warned, but we didn't do it. This comes from couples therapy. It comes from performance art. It's a thing if you ever want to sort of play with these topics ever again once you leave this room. I hope so, but it's a thing that you can do. So, being present is an empowering, process for yourself. It lets you work collaboratively. It lets you problem solve creatively. It lets you learn about the people around you, like your users. So, my advice is to look for something that's personally rewarding that you can practice to kind of strengthen that skill. If you want to know about my podcast or 2 books that I've written about user research, there they are. You can also find me on the interwebs at various things. So thank you guys very much for playing and trying the exercises and the good thoughts. Thank you very much.
What does mindful design look like? And that's a question from the audience.
I don't know. There's some people at I think it's Northumbria that have been doing some research on this. I tweeted these links the other day, and they're sort of a complicated, to me, academic design papers, which I think then still raises the question of what does it look like in the applied world. Yeah, I don't know. That's a term, I could make something up, but I don't know. That's a good exercise for people to figure out how does this stuff that we're talking about fit into their processes, fit into their work environment.
Yeah.
Do you think it back?
Do you think it has in it, or do you think some of the things that you've talked about, if people started to do that more, then it might then cascade into more mindful design?
Of course, yeah. I think these are ways of just dealing with the world and thinking about problems and dealing with each other. And we've heard sort of all day about the challenges in doing that well. If nothing else, being more mindful in the work environments that we're in is going to make all these things about meetings, about teams, about setting goals and accomplishing them. Yeah. I think it certainly facilitates that.
Yeah. I mean, the part of the question that I'm looking at now on the phone was actually answered by the things that you've talked about in the latter part of the talk. But I just want to make a statement and say that this person said, when struggling to concentrate on, say, a design, I try to focus on only that for 15 minutes. If I can do that, it can start to flow, but not always. Yeah. That was something that I dealt with, or tried to deal with, when I was younger than I am now. In the earlier days, and it is really hard to get started, and you can get to the end of that and then start thinking the worst designer in the world and so on and so forth, and those really random thoughts start going through your head. Just take your time. Use some of the things that Steve's talked about, because it will start to flow eventually, and it's just about being kind of one with yourself and be a little bit more kind of self-aware and just slow down. But thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.